I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar entitled The Middle East Today, a conversation with Professor Juan. And we're delighted to have with us Professor Cole. Professor Cole is Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan and the author of numerous influential articles and books. Since 2002, he has written a weblog, Informed Comment, juancole.com. He is an expert on the relationship of the West and the Muslim world within the relationship of the West and the Muslim world within the historical context. And this afternoon, we thank him for joining us to help us to gain a better understanding of the Middle East today. And before I turn it over to Professor Cole, I do want to thank, first of all, our administrative lead, Laura Large, for setting this up and promoting this. I also want to thank the co-sponsors of this event. They include, in addition to the MSU Muslim Studies program, the African Studies Center, Asian Studies Center, Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, Department of History, Department of Political Science, Global Studies in the Arts and Humanities, and James Madison College. And I should let folks know we are recording this webinar. And at the end or later on, we will have a chance to do Q&A. So with that, we will get started. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Cole.
Well, thank you. You've asked me to speak about the situation in the contemporary Middle East, which is a tense situation. There are a number of struggles going on. Of course, the primary one at the moment is the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. The ancillary to that struggle, however, is that Iran and what I call the alliance of resistance. It's often called the axis of resistance in the Western press, but I think its axis is usually used in a pejorative way. So Iran and its alliance of resistance, so-called, is also attempting to intervene in the struggle, and that intervention has taken the form of a number of attacks on bases where U.S. troops are stationed. 150 or so such attacks have been launched by Iraqi Shiite militias who are allied with Iran, and both in Iraq and in Syria, and most recently also in a small northern base in Jordan. Moreover, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon has also intervened and has struck at Israel on more than one occasion, and that conflict is muted but hot. The Hezbollah has struck at an Israeli base, for instance. It was not an occupied base, but the southern band of Lebanon, Lebanese territory, and the northern towns and hamlets of Israel are at the moment uninhabited. People have run away, and many Israeli observers are saying that it's not acceptable for Israeli residents in their own country to not be able to live in their homes, and that a strike at Hezbollah over these rocket attacks must be launched. And so the conflict in Gaza could easily spill over into an Israeli-Lebanese conflict, and a U.S. conflict, at least with the allies of Iran. The Biden administration seems not to want to risk a strike at Iran itself, but will, it has announced, hit back in revenge for the airstrikes or the drone strikes on American bases against the Party of God brigades, Kataib Hezbollah of Iraq, which is not related to the Lebanese Hezbollah. So there are many question marks here. Can the U.S. continue to station 2,500 U.S. troops in Iraq? These are now dedicated to training missions among the reconstituted Iraqi army, which had collapsed in 2014. When President Trump assassinated Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Jerusalem brigades of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, on January 3rd, 2020, he also assassinated the head of the Party of God brigades. And there were a number of attacks at that time by that Shiite militia on U.S. troops, and the Iraqi parliament voted in January of 2020 to demand that the prime minister find a way to usher U.S. troops out of Iraq. No prime minister has actually succeeded in doing that, and there's some question about how welcome the U.S. troops actually still are in Iraq. Different factions inside Iraq feel differently about their presence. But a small number of troops like that in an increasingly hostile military environment are perhaps not viable. They become hostages rather than troops. And the same thing is true for the some 900 U.S. troops in southeastern Syria, who again are said to have a mission of mopping up the remnants of the ISIL terrorist group, but who are rumored also to be trying to interfere with Iranian logistical movements in Syria, perhaps the resupply of Hezbollah in Lebanon. And there's some question about whether they're not helping to divert the oil produced by a few small oil fields in southeast Syria from the Damascus government, which is its legal owner, toward the Kurdish militia, the YPG, that helped the U.S. to defeat ISIL at Raqqa in the period 2014 to 2018. So the post-Bush architecture of the Middle East, where Iraq was reconstituted as a relative ally of the United States, and in the face of the rise of ISIL in 2014, the Obama administration, which had withdrawn troops from Iraq, actually put them back in. The question of whether that architecture that is a remnant of the U.S. direct intervention in the region, and then the struggle against the ISIL terrorist group, which had constituted itself as a state, can continue, whether the U.S. troops might not have to be withdrawn from Syria and Iraq, which I think hawks in Washington would see as a a benefit to Iran. And it's important to underline that although Iran represents itself as vehemently opposed to Israel's war on the Palestinians in Gaza, it hasn't done anything about it. And I think probably some of the Hamas militants who launched this horrific terrorist attack on Israel on October 7th, which left over 1,000 or over 1,100 people dead, as over 600 of them innocent non-combatant civilians. That when they launched this, they may have hoped to draw Iran and its allies into a more direct and more decisive struggle with Israel. They are alleged not to have told the Iranians that they were planning this operation because Iran was known to be penetrated by Israeli intelligence, and so they wanted to keep the operation secret. But if that was their expectation, it was a foolish one because Iran doesn't actually have a history of direct intervention in the region. It has intervened, obviously, in Syria, for instance, quite dramatically at the request of the Damascus government, but for its own purposes. But it hasn't gone around picking fights or invading. And the operation that the Iranians ran in Syria to uphold the government of Bashar al-Assad in Damascus was a status quo operation. It was keeping things as they had been rather than changing them dramatically. So likewise in Iraq, the Iranians intervened in a small way against ISIL. There were Iranian Revolutionary Guards troops on the ground, but they mainly liaised with Iraqi militias. And it was the Iraqi militias that did the heavy lifting early in the campaign against ISIL in 2014, 2015 at Amerla and Tikrit. So it is not in the character of Iranian policy in the region to do frontal interventions. And it appears to be that the Iranians pulled Hezbollah aside and advised them against getting heavily involved in this thing. I think for the sake of his own position, Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, has felt the necessity to strike out at Israel in relatively small ways, but it's more symbolic than anything else. And I don't believe that Hezbollah wants another war with Israel of the 2006 sort. And I think the Iranians are advising against provoking such a war. So the Hamas militants, the Qassam Brigade commanders who launched this attack, if they were hoping to draw Iran and its allies in, have failed, and with disastrous consequences for themselves, because obviously they cannot stand in the face of the military might of Israel, which is among the more advanced militaries in the region. And the Hamas has no armor, no air force, has light arms and a few rockets. And so it inevitably will suffer a horrible defeat, except to the extent that it can use guerrilla tactics to hide among the civilian population or in geographical places, unknown tunnels and so forth that the Israelis don't have access to. So the problem is that wars spin out of control. Nobody is in charge of them, really, and we don't know. Are the what I called symbolic attacks of Hezbollah on northern Israel sufficient to provoke the Israelis into a big Lebanon operation in the wake of the Gaza one? When the Shiite militias in Iraq are killing US troops, how long can the Biden administration stand up to the hawks in Washington and decline to strike at Iran? And if the US strikes at Iran itself, does that turn into a wider war? And of course, another corner of the alliance of resistance exists in Yemen, where the Helpers of God militia, Ansar Allah, or popularly known as the Houthis, have taken over northern Yemen since fall of 2014. Probably some 80% of the population of Yemen lives under their rule. And they, being in the north of Yemen, have a commanding view of the Red Sea. And so they have been intervening in the Gaza crisis by targeting container ships plying the Red Sea. You enter the Gulf of Mandab from the Gulf of Aden and ultimately the Indian Ocean, and go up through the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean. And on the order of 12% of world trade goes through the Red Sea. And if we just look at maritime trade, it's more like 30%. So that most container ship traffic has now been diverted to go around Africa is causing a spike in the cost of carriage, 180% increase in shipping costs as a result. The insurance on these ships is enormous, and insurance costs have spiked. And while there has not been a spike in petroleum costs, at the moment, 10% of the world's energy is shipped through the Suez Canal, including huge petroleum tankers and liquefied natural gas, and that there could be an impact on energy prices as well. Can't be ruled out if this kind of struggle continues. And the US response to the Houthis' provocation on behalf of the Palestinians in Gaza as they represent it has been now to bomb Sana'a. But when the Houthis took over, it was unacceptable to the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates in the region, and they launched a war in spring of 2015 against the Houthis, largely an air war, and of course, an air war against a guerrilla group is fated to fail. The UAE did put some troops on the ground, and they attempted to enlist the the anti-Houthi Yemenis, the nationalists, and the Southerners against the Houthis. They did deprive the Houthis of Aden in the south, but they couldn't dislodge them in the north. And they bombed them quite intensively. They bombed infrastructure in the capital, at the port of Hodeidah. So the likelihood that a few US and British airstrikes on Sana'a are going to change Houthi behavior is very low, slim to none. And therefore, this crisis of shipping in the Red Sea will continue, presumably as long as the Israeli offensive against Gaza does. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel has pledged that this war will go on for what he says are months. It's clear that that's not the preference of the Biden administration, which is supporting the war to the hilt. I mean, the war couldn't continue unless the Biden administration resupplied Israel on almost a daily basis. But the Israelis have run out of key munitions and ammunition. But although the Biden administration is making the war's continuation possible, they at least signal that they'd like to see it wrapped up. Of course, Biden has a presidential campaign to wage, and he cannot be completely oblivious to the blow that his reputation is taking from his full-throated participation in this battle. And that brings us then to another dimension of the Israeli campaign in Gaza, which is that it is remarkable for its brutality. No struggle in the 21st century has destroyed so much, killed so many in such a short period of time. The Russian invasion of the Donbass and Ukraine and the Russian attacks on Kyiv and other cities, as horrible as they are and as illegal in international law as they are, have not produced anywhere near the kind of casualties or the kind of infrastructural damage that the Israelis have inflicted on Gaza. And there has to be some question about whether this is really only a war on Hamas. The Israelis were perfectly able to assassinate a Hamas leader in Beirut, in Lebanon, long distance, and without killing anybody else at all. So if they really wanted to attack the Hamas leadership, it shouldn't be necessary to level Gaza. It seems that the Israelis are pursuing a scorched earth policy, deliberately attempting to make northern Gaza uninhabitable. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has spoken about making northern Gaza a buffer zone between the Palestinian population and that of southern Israel. But apparently an uninhabited buffer zone. And so some million people that had lived in northern Gaza would be permanently displaced under this plan to the south. Other Israeli officials have talked about ethnically cleansing the Palestinians out of Gaza entirely, making the whole place uninhabitable, and forcing the Palestinians to go elsewhere, the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, have them distributed among various Arab countries. None of these plans for a complete ethnic cleansing of 2.2 million Palestinians seem very plausible, but they are broached on a daily basis and at the highest levels of the war cabinet. in Israel. So I personally don't think that the level of destruction that the Israelis have inflicted on Gaza to date can be explained by a war on Hamas. This is a conflict that seems designed to re-engineer Gaza. So all the universities in the country have been destroyed. Some of them were destroyed with mines, which means they weren't collateral damage. Somebody sat down in a room and planned out their destruction, and it was accomplished without any war fighting. And presidents of universities have been killed. Whether it's, of course, impossible to know the mind of the pilots, whether this was deliberate or not. Provosts have been killed, faculty have been killed, writers, artists, and students have been killed or left without the prospect of an education. The same things have happened at the K through 12 level. Many schools became inoperable because they're being used as shelters. When the Israelis launched their campaign, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that there would be no deliveries of water or food or fuel to Gaza. Gaza is surrounded by Israel, except for the Rafah crossing at Egypt, which the Israelis also indirectly control. And it had been under siege since 2007 with a carefully calibrated regime of aid shipments. Because it was under economic siege, it has no airport, it has no seaport, it can't import and export freely. Unemployment was 54% in general and 70% among youth. The 10% of children showed signs of stunting from malnutrition. It was one of the great humanitarian crises in the world before this year. And then after October 7th, well over half the population has been driven out of their homes. 70% of those homes have been damaged and a significant number simply destroyed. The Israeli press has carried statements by military commanders saying that they would drop bombs on buildings because they thought that Hamas operatives lived there, and without regard to the deaths that they would bring to civilian non-combatants who also lived in the same residential complexes. That's, of course, a horrible war crime. And the combination of the uncompromisingly hostile statements of Israeli leaders and cabinet officials and military men about what their plans were for the people of Gaza, and then the actual strikes on, as I say, civilian infrastructure, dropping 2,000-pound bombs on residential complexes, which are guaranteed to kill large numbers of civilians. All of these things have resulted in charges by South Africa that Israel is pursuing a genocide, as it's defined in contemporary international law. Intention is important here. Does Israel intend to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians? And does it intend to affect their ability to live, to reproduce, to keep their culture going? Well, if you destroy all of their universities and many of their intellectuals, that's maybe a sign that you don't want their culture to continue. And if you crowd them into a small portion of Gaza in the south, deprive them of enough food and water to live healthily, that's also maybe a sign that you're committing genocide. So the case has gone to the International Court of Justice. And the South Africans asked for a ruling on the commission of genocide, but they also asked for what I think in this country we would call a preliminary injunction. That, you know, if you go to a judge and say a crime is being committed at the moment, and until it can be adjudicated, could you please stop it from going forward? The judge will issue a preliminary injunction. That's basically what the International Court of Justice did. It instructed Israel to cease doing anything that looked like a genocide, to stop killing innocent non-combatants, and to make sure to keep the records of the military tactics that were being used. So the court refused to dismiss the case, and it appears to have accepted that the charge of genocide is plausible, that there's a case here to be adjudicated, and that in the meantime, it wants these actions to cease. A lot of the Western reporting emphasized that the court did not order a ceasefire or say anything really about the military aspect of the conflict with Gaza, with Hamas, but that wasn't the issue before it. The court was ruling on whether innocent non-combatants were being killed at such a rate and in such a way as to constitute genocide. And there, it did instruct the Israelis to cease killing people. The Israelis have rejected the court's finding, and the United States, Canada, Germany, and other Western countries who were enthusiastic about the International Court of Justice's findings in similar cases against Russia and Ukraine, against Myanmar with regard to the Rohingya, and elsewhere, have instead attempted to run interference for the Israelis in this case. And the stench of hypocrisy from the Western capitals is so overwhelming that many observers from the global South are wondering whether this international order, the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention, the Rome Statute, whether it isn't all mere stage scenery for a perfidious Western performance of favoritism, so that enemies can be slammed through these institutions, but friends are protected from them. And I think that's one of the more serious developments to come out of this conflict, is whether the international lattice work of treaties and laws and institutions that were developed after World War II to attempt to prevent the kinds of atrocities that were committed in World War II from occurring again, even while admitting that it's unlikely that you could stop the conflicts themselves, whether that lattice work is not in danger of now simply collapsing and throwing us back to the jungle of 1943. So Mohammed, this is kind of what I had to say about the whole thing. Did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Kuhl, for that sobering commentary. At this time, we would like to open the floor for questions for Q&A. I would invite attendees to type in their questions in the Q&A box, or whatever you want to call it. If you're on a cell phone or if you're on a smartphone, you might have to look around a little bit, look for the three dots, and you might find it there. I'll start with a question that I think is on the minds of many. I know that there are many folks who are calling for a ceasefire. And one question that often comes up is, well, how do we get there? Is it possible? How do we get to a ceasefire? So what would be your response to that question?
Well, the negotiations that are taking place about a ceasefire between the Israeli head of intelligence, the U.S. CIA director, the Americans and the Qataris are involved. These negotiations are between Hamas and the Hamas leadership in exile, and the Israeli government, and each side is looking for certain things. The Israelis have maximalist demands that Hamas be dissolved as an organization. Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to turn the Gaza Strip into the West Bank in the aftermath of the war, so that Israeli troops would patrol it and keep security. And of course, the Israelis desperately want the hostages back that Hamas took on October 7th. Hamas is willing to give the hostages back, but it wants the Israelis to release prisoners that it has taken. Often, the Israeli practice is to arrest Palestinians whom it suspects of militant activity and to keep them in prison without charge. It's called administrative detention, and of course, it's quite illegal in international law. So Hamas is demanding the release of those prisoners, and that was done when the last negotiation succeeded in creating a pause. This time, the Israelis are saying that they refuse to release anybody. So, if you get to a pause, another ceasefire, then it will be because each side has compromised and accepted some of the demands of the other side. And I think the Biden administration is hoping that if you could get a ceasefire and you could get a basic agreement on steps to be taken to achieve it, that it's a little unlikely that you would go back to a fully fledged war in the aftermath. So that a ceasefire would be a step towards a new status quo.
Well, related to this, we have two questions. One here says, what are America's calculations behind its unflinching support of Israel? And why have Arab countries not advocated for Gazans more strongly? And related to this, we have another person who writes, thank you very much for speaking today, Dr. Cole. One of the remarkable things about this recent uptick in the war has been the relative lack of a strong response from other Arab and Muslim states. What would you say is the most likely reason for this inaction?
Right. Well, with regard to the Arab states, they don't like Hamas. They view it as dangerous. Egypt's government is really a military junta. I mean, the president wears a civilian suit now, but he came into power as a military coup maker. And the military had intervened against the opening of Egyptian politics during the Arab Spring in 2011 through 2013, and the rise to power of the Muslim Brotherhood, which the military has by now crushed. It was a recognized political party that elected a president and a majority in parliament in 2011 and 2012, but then Now it is banned, and the whole organization has been destroyed. Its leaders were jailed, and some of them are dead. So Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Egyptian officer corps couldn't be more pleased at the prospect of Hamas being uprooted and destroyed. Likewise, the Gulf states, or some of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in particular, view Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood as forms of dangerous radical populism that they and as dangers to their thrones. Were large numbers of people in the Gulf to become members of the Muslim Brotherhood, they're afraid the Saudi royal family and the United Arab Emirates royal family couldn't survive. That these are, they view the Muslim Brotherhood the way the Americans viewed communism in the McCarthy era. So to the extent, again, that Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood and shares in that general kind of fundamentalist populism, the Gulf states are very happy to see it crushed. They're not happy at the degree of death and destruction wrought on the civilians of Gaza, but it's not worth it to them to intervene about that, and they don't want to be on the wrong side of Washington or the Israelis in this regard. There isn't anything at stake for them politically in all this. So I imagine that when the whole thing does end, and eventually it will, the Israelis will go to those wealthy Gulf states and say, won't you please give money to rebuild? And then they likely will. There's, I think things might have been different if this war were between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, which the Saudis have backed. But it's not. It's not with the Palestinian Arab nationalists. It's with Hamas, and it's also with a branch of Hamas apparently that went in an even more radical direction than it had traditionally taken, because the tactics of October 7th were not typical Hamas tactics. I mean, Hamas back in the 90s did, commit acts of terrorism. It has shot rockets at civilian towns and done some damage that way, sometimes killed people. But to have 3,000 operatives come over the border, some of them on hang gliders, and attack a peace music festival and mow down people, Instagram influencers who are dancing at this music festival, to destroy a kibbutz, Be'eri, which was known as the last bastion of the Israeli peaceniks. All of this is weird, and it's more resembles the tactics of ISIL. In the ISIL political philosophy, they had a doctrine of what they called tawahush, acting like wild beasts. If you are unpredictable and violent and brutal, nobody will dare to stand against you. The people that you've already conquered won't put up a resistance, and the outsiders will be afraid of you. So that October 7th attack looked to me an awful lot like ISIL tawahush, beastliness. Maybe some of the younger cadres of the Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, came under the influence of ISIL. But in the same way that ISIL in the end had no allies and was destroyed because everybody was against it, Hamas has now put itself in that situation of having no allies, and people being, they will be celebrating if it is destroyed. So there's no reason for anybody in the region to stand up for Hamas. And even as I said, the Iranian-backed alliance of resistance doesn't seem to want to get very, very much involved. And they've mainly carried out kind of symbolic protests about this war. With regard to why the Americans allow no daylight between the Netanyahu government and its policies, it's a little bit of a mystery. I mean, it's another weird thing, and most of these anomalies can only be explained by multiple causal effects. What the Marxists call something being overdetermined. So I do think that the foreign policy establishment, the security establishment in Washington, sees Israel as an essential component of American security in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Israelis do things for them, gather intelligence, and allow them to preposition military materiel, cooperate with Washington closely in all kinds of ways, and that what Ben Rhodes called the blob, the former national security advisor, the blob in Washington is very attached to Israel and sees it as very useful to the United States and would be very unhappy to see its effectiveness blunted. So that's one. I mean, Walt and Mearsheimer argued that the domestic constituency for Israel in US politics has a powerful effect in Congress and on the president. And they were careful to say that this is not only a matter of Jewish Americans, many of whom don't approve of Netanyahu or his government or much that's being done in this war. But then you have the evangelicals who have their own theological reasons for knee-jerk support of Israel. So that's another factor that has to be taken into account. But I have to say it's a little bit puzzling. I mean, I could understand Washington supporting Israel very strongly in a conflict with Hamas in the wake of the kind of terror attack that Hamas launched. And of course, the American public is traumatized by this kind of thing after 9/11. But to wave away the deaths of, now it's, officially from the Gaza Ministry of Health, some nearly 27,000 people, 70% of whom are estimated to be women and minors. And of the rest, large numbers are male non-combatants. To wave this away and just pretend it's not happening or it's not important, that it's all right, is a level of callousness that just shocks me. I mean, Joe Biden denied the statistics that I just cited. He doesn't have any confidence in them, as if he can just wish them away, make them disappear. And even there are dissent channels in the State Department where diplomats who know the score have complained bitterly that the president is a major center of disinformation in this war. And it's even more puzzling because Biden doesn't like Netanyahu and was upset with him for forming an essentially fascist government when he came back to power the last time, and wouldn't host him in Washington. Netanyahu was in Biden's bad books right up until October 7th, to the point where they weren't speaking. He wasn't reaching out diplomatically. And then all of a sudden, Biden is 100%. So when you get to that level of callousness and detail, it seems to me that you also have to take into account the personality and the long-term commitments of Biden, who seems not able to see the Palestinians. They're not real people to him. He can only see the Israelis, and that's of course not all that unusual in high American politics.
Just a quick question to clarify something. There's been a lot of talk about, what happened on October 7th, and there's been talk about, the IDF may have, playing a role in, in causing some of the casualties as part of as collateral casualties as part of their response to Hamas. What's your assessment of this? I don't, for those of us who may not know the details.
Well, of course, there's a fog of war. You're not sure exactly what happened. There was some friendly fire. I think that's clear, and it's not. The details of it haven't been investigated. There's some thinking that some of the damage done at the music festival had to have been done by armor, which Hamas doesn't have. But if it's true that 1,100 and odd number of people were killed, and each life is precious, how many of them were killed by Israeli crossfire or friendly fire and so forth. And my estimation, given what we now know, is that it's a relatively small number. And I fear that there's a kind of October 7th denialism. And one of our authors at my Informed Comment blog wrote about this today. That's being embraced on the fringes of the American left. That October 7th, almost all of it was, is the Israeli military. And that's distasteful. Any conspiracy theory like that, I think, detracts from us as human beings. So I'm not at all saying that your question was out of line. It's a legitimate question, is how much of this was friendly fire. But my estimation is that it was a relatively small part of the destruction and the loss of life on that day, and that Hamas really does bear responsibility for this. And I think there are members of Hamas, because it's a political party. There's a political party, and then there's a military wing. The military wing undertook this operation without telling anybody else or without consulting with anybody else. It was a very close set of individuals that planned it out and undertook it. I think that there are almost certainly, Hamas political members who are appalled by what the Qassam brigades and their allies did. I've seen people like Ismail Hania, who lives in Qatar, is part of the political leadership. He denied the music festival massacre. He said, we wouldn't do something like that. Well, is he just being disingenuous, or was that really not part of the plan as he understood it? So, but it obviously was an atrocity, and it was committed by Hamas.
We have time for maybe two more questions. So I'll try to sneak these in quickly. Hello, Professor Cole. Could you comment on the religious element being used to characterize the conflict and its impact on regional politics and the relations of civilians and countries like the United States, most notably Ansarullah in Yemen, and feeling religious duty to intervene, and Jewish Zionist motivations for greater expansion and expulsion of the Palestinian population?
Sure. Well, there is a religious rhetoric around some of these events. The Ansarullah are a Zaydi Shiite movement that deploys religious rhetoric, and the Iraqi Party of God Brigades is also, it quotes the Quran and so forth, and they appeal to religious rhetoric. And then the religious Zionist movement in Israel, which has now gotten onto the cabinet, and it seems to have influenced an old secularist Likudnik like Netanyahu, who is quoting the Bible all of a sudden. It's certainly the case that religious rhetoric is being deployed. But as Scott Prosterman wrote in my blog today, you know, October 7th was contrary to Sharia or Islamic law. The Islamic law of war does not permit sneak attacks, killing innocent non-combatants, and so forth. And the Israeli the Israeli disregard for civilian life in the prosecution of this conflict in Gaza is also contrary to halakha, to Israeli legal thinking and ethics, and of course, or Jewish, I meant to say, Jewish legal ethics. And there's a very long history of Jews thinking about ethics, and much of what we recognize as the province of the field of ethics has Jewish origins. So I have to say I tend to discount this religious rhetoric because people are deploying it for purposes that seem antithetical to some of the best impulses inside these religions. And I think it's easy to politicize religion and to use it as a cover for doing what you want to do. So the Houthis, may say that they're sympathetic with the innocent civilians of Gaza, and that's why they're hitting these container ships. But the container ships that they have hit are often not Israeli, and they don't have anything to do with the war. And so they're just striking out at innocent people.
We have time for one more question. This actually was the first question we received. Thank you very much for your thoughts on the geopolitics of the region. I'm wondering, though, what your thoughts are on the pursuit of war, specifically urban warfare, since 2001, Iraq forward.
Yeah. Well, the willingness of various forces to use air strikes against guerrilla groups in dense urban environments is very distressing. And it's another place where I think we need a whole new treaty, a whole new convention. The US did this in Iraq, and the Pentagon did a lot of propaganda that, it has very precise munitions and they can hit a building from a certain direction and make sure that the civilians aren't harmed and so forth. And you blow up a building from the air, the windows break and the fragments of the building and the windows go flying, and they put people's eyes out, and it's like shrapnel. You're creating shrapnel, and unless they are fortunate enough to hit the ground before it hits them. I think it was a good thing that ISIL was defeated. The character of the campaign from the air and on land to some extent in Old Mosul was a little bit disturbing. And especially when President Trump came in, he seems to have lifted the rules of engagement, or loosened them, I mean to say, so that under Obama, if you knew there was a family in an apartment building and there was a ISIL sniper on the roof of the building, you couldn't just call in an airstrike and destroy the building, and it's too bad about what happened to the family. You had to try to find a way to get the family out before you hit. But under Trump, those rules of engagement were allegedly loosened, and Amnesty International found that there's a spike of 3,000 extra civilian casualties in the aftermath of that Trump directive. So I do think that the questioner raises this very important question: is to what extent is the aerial bombardment of dense urban settlements to get at a guerrilla group, a legitimate form of warfare? And I think it's a gray area now in the law. It's something that, because of the fog of war, it's very difficult to adjudicate these things. And there are even people who are arguing that, what the Israelis have done in Gaza is the only thing you could do, or it's justifiable given their war aims, and that they're not trying to kill so many people and so forth. So that's an argument I think the world has to have.